Our God throughout the ages has been in a relationship with the people that knew him and follow him, really are part of his family, we would say. A covenant quite often is made between God and people. Sometimes the covenant's made between people and people. We read about that in the Old Testament, both those occasions, and there's many different ways they make covenants and different reasons and different severity regarding the covenant. And today I was thinking, well, we make covenants sometimes with people. In other words, a promise, or I guess we could say a deal, and they work in different ways. I was thinking about buying a house. So if you're going to buy a house, maybe one of the first things you would do regarding covenants is you'd find a realtor. Now, a realtor would want you perhaps to sign a covenant with them to say that you're going to be exclusively using them. In other words, they're not going to show you all the houses you want, and the last minute go to another realtor and, all the commission goes to them, so they make a covenant with you. But in that covenant, maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room, right? So she wants 6%, and maybe you only want to pay 5% or something like that. So it can be a give and a take, a little bit of understanding between the two, and so they share in the covenant, share responsibilities. But then you eventually find a house that you like, and then you make a promissory covenant, right, where you'd make an offer on the house, which again is a covenant, and again, that's something that you sign. It's a legal document. It's something you're saying this is what you're going to do, and sometimes they even want a little bit of money up front, right, a little bit of earnest money or deposit, something of that nature. So that's another covenant that you would make. But many people cannot afford to buy a house without also getting a loan. You ever had one of those? No, that's what I call a covenant, right? Who reads all that? Right? You go through it all, and have you ever done that before? You're sitting there in the closing, and you're like, okay, stop. Before I sign, I want to read it. Well, the idea is you want to read it before you got there, because it's going to take an hour or two just to figure it out. But when you're there, it's not like, well, the bank wants 6.9%, and I'm only prepared to pay 5.1%. Yeah, there's no deals going on. Why? Good, the bank's got all the money. You need some, right? You have no say in the matter. Either you sign it or you don't sign it. You buy the house, you don't buy the house. It's over, right? Different kind of covenant. And then if you're blessed enough to have property association, right? Neighborhood association, fees, and covenants. It's a covenant. You got to sign it and say, this is what I'll do. And in those covenants, it kind of says, well, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. And you do this, this is going to happen. It's all laid out for you if you read it. So that's kind of what a covenant is. This is what God does in covenant, and that's kind of what we read about even with God talking with Abraham and saying it's time for you to leave your home and your family and everything that is comfortable, the things that you're used to, the place in your life where maybe you feel like finally I've accomplished something, I've gotten of age, and I'm mature now. And do you ever get settled in sometimes? It's hard to leave, right? It's hard to move. It's hard to make a change. But now God's saying, I'm going to give you something. I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to give you many offspring throughout the years. I'm going to make a promise that's going to bless the world. I'm even going to give you some land. It's going to be the land of Canaan. It's quite a big area. It's quite fertile land. It's a beautiful place. It's a covenant that God's making with Abraham. But one of these is the promised son. And there's kind of something that's happening in this covenant that God's making. So the Bible reading today that Larry brought us from Genesis chapter 12, this is kind of just a layout. He just read it. So this is something, again, we're probably a little familiar with this covenant that God made with him to say, I'm going to give you a great nation. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to make you a blessing, and you're going to be able to bless the whole world. And all these things are going to happen because I am making a covenant with you. I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to make this happen. It's really not up to Abram. His name was Abram at this time. It will be eventually Abraham, right? So Abram is kind of like, the beloved father, the sovereign father. It's just kind of, a good father, Abram. Just minor technicality. Got no kids, but he's a great father, right? Now, before he has kids, God says, I've even got a better idea. We're going to change your name to Abraham, which means father of many children. How can life get more awkward, right? You meet somebody in the store. Hey, what's your name? My name's Abraham, father of many children. Oh, fantastic. How many kids do you got? Well, none so far. Okay, hang on. You're 90 years old. And in the first 90 years of your life, you had no children, you're still waiting? Any day now. Like, it's crazy. But it's a covenant that God made. God's going to follow through. Abraham trusted. He believed. So just kind of a brief synopsis of what's going on. Genesis chapter 12, they move down to Egypt, get even richer. God blesses them. They leave Egypt. And then Abraham and Lot, their people kind of get into a dispute and they separate. And after they've separated, I'm not going to get into all that. That's a whole nother lesson. But after that, God says to Abraham, look out of all the land. It's going to be yours one day. It's going to be in your family. It's going to belong to you. It's the promised land. This is for you. This is what I'm giving you. And then chapter 14, Lot is living in Sodom and Gomorrah area, and it was invaded by different nations. Several kings got together and fought against Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were defeated. Lot and all of his goods and all the city were all taken away as captives. And Abraham says, I mean, this is, to me, it's almost like a trust in God, because you can imagine how big and strong these military people were to take over 3 cities. And God says, or Abraham says, I'm going to get my men together. I think it was 417. It doesn't sound like a very big army. It's bigger than what I have, but we're going to go out and get everything back. So they go out and fight, successful, bring everybody back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Everybody's restored. The nations have been defeated. And I'm thinking at this point, this is kind of where the lesson's going to land, is in Genesis chapter 15. And Abraham starts out by being afraid. So if you want to follow along in your Bible, you could pretty well just stick there in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 1. We can tell the fear of Abraham, because God has to say, after these things, after this fighting and the bringing the people back and the restoration, and you think maybe he's a little bit afraid that somebody may come and fight against him again? Like maybe these nations he's conquered are going to get other nations, and I don't know what he's afraid of. Maybe he's just afraid of the future. Maybe he's afraid he's not going to get the promise what God promised, because he has a little bit of doubt there. The Lord came to Abraham. This is what he said in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. See, the shield term kind of sounds a little bit like military, doesn't it? I'm your protector. I'm going to watch over you. Things are not going to happen to you, because I'm there as your shield. I'm there to stand in the way between anything that can destroy you, because I've made a covenant, a promise, and it's going to have to be fulfilled. And so I'm watching over you. So there's no need to fear. And your reward will be very great. Abraham still has a little bit of a struggle and a little bit with this land promise. Okay, he's going to give me a son, but what about the land? And so Abraham's kind of going back and forth with God, saying, I'm kind of getting older, and I'm still waiting for the promise. Can you do something that would re-engage this promise? Help me with this promise. I want to believe, but I'm still struggling a little bit. So God took Abraham outside and he said, look toward the heavens and number the stars. Count them. Can you count the stars? We got a little children's song about that. Can you count the stars? Well, there's so many stars. And today we know that there's a lot more than Abraham even saw or could have counted or believed. We know there's billions of stars, but count the stars. And this is what God said, so shall your offspring be. You will have many offspring, not just one, many. So he's going to have one promised child, but that's going to grow into a whole nation of people, right? And then eventually we get to the days of like Saul and David and Solomon, where they were very great, powerful, and a large group. So God fulfills this covenant, but sometimes it's just hard to believe. But he did believe. And this is the verse that's quoted several times in the New Testament. And Abraham believed the Lord, and God counted it to him as righteousness. His righteousness was just in accepting and believing, saying, God, I trust you. And so God says, well, I'm going to not only give you a son, I'm going to give you some land. And Abraham's like, boy, I'm still struggling with this. I'm still struggling with it. So God says, let's make a covenant. Okay, so there's several different ways that people make covenants back then, just like there's several ways today. Now, making a covenant today, a lot of times is done with a pen and paper, right? Everybody with me on that? Back then, they didn't do pen and paper. Sometimes they actually lived out their covenant to say, this is what the covenant is going to be. This is what's happening here in Genesis chapter 15. I'm sure we've all read through it and said, what in the world is going on? So it looks like initially God says, Abraham says, well, how do I know that I shall possess the land? How do I know it's going to be mine, this land? How do I know? Well, God says, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, turtle dove, and a pigeon. Great, we're going to have lunch, and then we can talk about it. Well, that's not exactly what they're going to do, and Abraham knew that. But we don't really know that, because that's not the way we make covenants. But in this case, they're going to make a covenant. God's going to make a covenant with people, with Abraham. And again, covenants are made in different ways throughout the Old Testament. So here they've got these animals. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But maybe just kind of as a side note about covenants. So you remember with Laban and Jacob. So Jacob had left his home because he got his brother Esau and his dad fairly mad at him. He went and lived with Uncle Laban. And there he worked and he worked and he worked and he worked for 7 years so he could have a beautiful woman, and he ended up getting her sister. And then he worked another 7 years, got the woman, and all that stuff. And then Laban kind of cheated him many times over. He wanted to leave, couldn't leave. Laban kept begging him to stay and saying, let's have a party before he just never got around to leaving. So what do you think? He just left. He left without saying goodbye. So Laban in the morning is like, everybody's gone. He took my girls, he took my stuff, the grandkids, they're all gone, So Laban gets on his horses with his army, rides out to find Jacob and to say, boy, we're going to have a little talk. And so he finally catches up to him and says, why have you done this? Why did you leave? You didn't even say goodbye. And so they had this discussion. But anyway, at the end of the discussion, things are settled down. Everybody's okay. Laban says, okay, I'll go back home. But this is what we're going to do. We're going to make a covenant. Okay? So this is the covenant. See, this is not the way we make covenants, though. But anyway, so they said, we're going to get a stone. So Jacob said, okay, we'll put a stone here. And Jacob said, get the other guys together. Let's get some stones. We're going to make a big stone pile, right? And so what Laban says is this, that this side of the stone pile is kind of my area, and that side's your area. You can come over time to visit, but don't you come over to fight me. And I'm not going to go over to your side to fight you. We're not going to be pursuing each other. We're not going to be embittered against each other. We're going to make peace. Right? So he's not saying never come back, but he's saying this is going to be a witness between you and me. As a matter of fact, maybe I'll just read a little bit of exactly what was said regarding that covenant and how it worked out. So in verse 49 of Genesis 31, this is what was said. The Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one else is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. So this is a covenant made in the presence of God. In a way, it almost sounds like a marriage covenant, doesn't it? We don't do a lot in marriage covenants. We make vows. We do sign a piece of paper, but it's made in the presence of God. And what this is saying, you may leave, and I'll maybe never even see you again. Hopefully we'll be able to meet for Thanksgiving. But I don't know. We may never see each other, but you better take care of my girls. They're my family. Take care of them. I'm not going to be there to see you, but God's there to see you. And if you break this covenant, God's going to be after you. He's going to make the judgment. He's going to create the opposition for you so that you will not succeed. He's going to punish you if you do not follow this commitment, this covenant we made today. And these rocks are a sign of the covenant. And if anybody ever passed that way, what's this pile of rocks here for? Oh, it was a covenant that was made years ago between Jacob and Laban. It's pretty serious. You don't make a covenant in the name of God and calling down really what we'd say curses of God if I do not fulfill this covenant. So that's kind of what one covenant looks like. But this is actually not even the covenant. That sounds pretty strict, doesn't it? It sounds pretty serious. You don't enter a covenant like that lightly. It's dangerous. Well, we're going to go back to what God told Abraham to do. He said, well, go get the cow, Okay, maybe I should just back up one verse so I can remember all that he said. I can look at pictures. All right, so there's a heifer, which is a 3-year-old cow. It's a female cow, never had calves. I was going to say cowlets, but it doesn't go very well. Calves. And a female goat and a ram. So these are the animals. What's he going to do with the animals? Well, again, I'm not going to read through it all, but he's going to cut the animals down the middle. So they're dead, cut down the middle, laid apart. And now there's a pathway between the animals. You see that? I mean, if you're reading along, you can't. But if not, read it sometime and see what happens and figure out what's going on. Because this is what happens. This is a covenant God is making with Abraham. Covenants are made just like Jacob and his father-in-law, Laban. See, I've got my end of the covenant. You got your end of the covenant. You do what you're supposed to. I'll do what I'm supposed to do. And if not, there's consequences. So you make the covenant. And this has happened sometimes in the Old Testament. We make the covenant. I would walk down through the pieces of these dead animals, through blood, with the person I made the covenant with. We're walking together between the pieces of dead animals, saying, if I do not keep my end of the covenant, may I be like this. Cut me open, lay me out, put me to death. It's a pretty serious covenant. That's the covenant that actually God made with Israel a little bit later on. That was the covenant of Moses, right? Where God says, I will bless you, I'll watch over you, things will go well if you follow me. And now if you don't follow me, there will be curses, there'll be responsibilities, there'll be things that'll happen to you that you'll wish that you didn't break the covenant. But there was a covenant like that. And at some point, I don't know when, but the people of Israel made that covenant with God. And it comes up in the book of Jeremiah to explain what's going on. So Jeremiah 34, verse 18, God is mad at the people. They've not kept their end of the covenant. But this is what God says. It's helping us understand what's going on in Genesis chapter 15. The men who transgressed my covenant, you've broken my covenant. You've not done what you said you were going to do. But you did not keep the terms of the covenant that were made before me. Listen, I will make them like the calf that they cut into two and pass between its parts. And the officials of Judah and the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs and the priests and all the people of the land who have passed between the parts of the calf. At some point, they did this covenant with God, with Moses, walking through this split apart animal, walking between the parts to say, that's what this is saying. That's the covenant saying, if I don't keep my end of the covenant, may this happen to me. So we go back to Genesis chapter 15. So when the sun had gone down, it was dark. And behold, a smoldering fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. This is the cut apart animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. So Abraham is seeing this. This is God. It's not, it's actually, how does God actually do it? Well, he shows up in a picture form of smoldering fire pot and a flaming torch. This is God going through the pieces of dead animals. And God is saying, if I don't keep my end of the covenant, may I be like them. May I be cut apart. May my blood be spilt. May I suffer. I'm willing to take that on. This is how serious this covenant is. God's saying, I'm taking this on. But that's not all. God's saying, I'm willing to take this covenant on. But you want to know something that's missing? Abraham never walked through the pieces of the dead animals. And I'm sure when he was laying out the pieces, he was thinking, if this is what I think it is, I'm going to be in a lot of trouble. Because I know me. And I know my people. I know God. He can keep the covenant. I don't think I can keep the covenant. And if I can't keep the covenant, I'll be like these animals. What God says is, you don't need to keep the covenant. I'll keep my end of the covenant. I'll keep my side. I'll keep what I've promised. And Abraham, in his mind, I don't know if he would have ever said that, but God, what if I don't keep my end of the covenant? And God would respond, I will die for you. You fail, I'll take upon the suffering and the pain and the bloodshed and the humiliation and death. The promised Son is going to fulfill something obviously we could never do ourselves. Because we have failed so miserably in keeping the covenant. And yet God is saying, I'll pay the price. I'll be the sacrifice. I'll be like these dead animals. Perhaps how God works in an amazing way. A few hundred years later, Isaiah writes this about the sacrifice. Maybe this helps us understand Genesis 15. It says a lot in Isaiah 53 about, we call it the suffering Savior, the Messiah, who's going to come. He's going to die for his people. Just a couple verses I pulled out. And there's others that are in there I could have quoted, but the Messiah was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we're healed. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. The perfect God came down to earth in a human form, the Son of God, Jesus, who lived a perfect life, followed everything his Father told him to do and asked him to do, trusted fully in God's direction, his promise, followed the plan, was faithful. And he's the one who died, taking upon our sin upon himself, so that his righteousness we would receive in place of our sin. It was just a direct exchange, really. He took our sin, we took his righteousness. He took upon our suffering, we took upon his peace. He took our death, we took his life. It's the promise that God made from the very beginning, that he was going to create a plan, something for us to follow, something for us to experience. Even from the very early pages of the Bible, God is making covenant promises, building a relationship of faith and trust with his people. God continues to do that today. I can't express how thankful I am to live in the world today. Certainly, I wouldn't want to have lived in the world in the days of Jesus. I mean, the miracles would have been quite impressive. His teaching would have been nice to hear. I probably wouldn't have understood it. I wouldn't have been able to figure out what the miracles are all about. It's just pretty cool. I wouldn't have understood why he died. The resurrection would have been question mark. But boy, when you can read it in the Bible, you just kind of go through it. Well, we would say to see the end of the story, to see what God's been up to all along, to see it was just a fulfillment of all the promises he ever made. At first, Peter says that we didn't even really understand. I think in 2 Peter chapter 1, even angels long to look into these things, but they don't know. They may know now, but they didn't know even when the prophecies were being made. But we can see it because God's given us the story. He's given us his word. And through that, we find that God is a covenant-keeping God. And we very quickly learn that people are not very good at all of keeping covenants, of being faithful, of doing what they said they were going to do. God has made the way, even where there seemed to be no way. He's asking us, like Abraham, do you believe in me? Now, a lot of people today say, I believe in God. So the next question is, from God, do you believe me? Not do you believe in me, do you believe me when I say something? When I say this is the plan. This is your opportunity. This is your life. This is the way. This is what truth is. Do you believe me when I say this? We respond by saying, yes, I believe. I believe. And that's what a Christian is. Just somebody who says, I believe God. I believe God. What does that mean? Well, if you believe God, then it's pretty easy. It's like, well, I understand what God said he promised he'd do for me. And I would say, well, God, what do you want me to do? And ultimately, he really says, you don't do anything. But we do respond. See, there's a difference, isn't there? So there's another covenant that sometimes people make, and that's when they do a will, right? Maybe a lot of us had parents who made a will. And as children, you may have never seen the will until they actually died. It's like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I get nothing. Just kidding. Anyway, so it's like, wow, so you're here reading, but they've made a covenant. They've made a contract. They've made their wishes known, and it will happen according to the will. And you may protest it, but it's like, well, this is what they want. It's their money. It's their house. It's their possession. They do what they want, and now they're dead, but we'll do what the will says. So what do you do to receive what they promised? Well, nothing. You don't work for it. There's nothing you can do. But it helps to show up when they're reading the will, or it helps to open the letter when they send you the notification of what you get from the will. And it helps if they've actually got some stuff for you to actually go pick it up. And if they even gave you $1 million out of the will, you still have to take the check and go to the bank. You didn't earn it, but there's something you do to receive the blessing of the will. And it's the same thing with God. I believe God. Well, good. This is what you do then. You say, if you believe God, you say, I'm going to serve God. I'm going to love God. I'm going to do what God asks me to do. I'm going to believe him and act upon it. And I'm not going to live for myself anymore. I'm going to live for him. And mostly that is now not motivated by fear. It's motivated by love. Again, if you read Genesis 15 and you see love in there, you say, boy, I want to serve I want to follow this kind of God. I want to listen to him. I mean, he loves me beyond anything I could have ever imagined. So we don't want to serve ourselves anymore. We want to serve him. We want to love him. We want to follow him. And God says, if you want to be in a relationship with me, be baptized. It's not complicated. It's not work. I've been baptized, and I've baptized many people. It's more work for the baptizer than for the baptizee. So if anybody's working back there, it's me, right? But ultimately, God's the one who's working. You're getting baptized. It's like, well, look what I did. You know, I worked so hard for this. It's like, I'm the one who worked. I mean, you'd still be down in that water if I didn't pull you back up, right? You didn't work for it. You just said, I want to accept it. God, what do you have for me? I want to accept it. When we're baptized, what does that mean? That's when we enter into the covenant that God made. God's saying, here's the covenant. It's for everybody. It's for you, for your neighbor, for your family member, for the guy at work. It's the covenant's for everybody. But you got to accept it, right? Got to accept the covenant. Got to say, I want to be in the covenant. So baptism puts us inside the covenant because at that point, our sins are forgiven. We receive God's Spirit, which is what? The pledge. A pledge of what? A pledge of all the covenant blessings that are ours in Christ Jesus. The Holy Spirit does a whole lot more than that, but that's one of the things. It is a pledge of the covenant. If today you want to be in the covenant with God, that's it. You say, God's done it. He's paid the price. He's died for my sins. I just want to accept it. God, open my heart. Let me see. Let me hear. Let me understand what your covenant's all about. I want to be a part of it. So if we can encourage you today, if we can be a blessing, maybe you want to study the Bible more on this idea of God's plan, his covenant, his relationship with you, and what Jesus did on the cross. So we're going to sing a song, Where He Leads, I'll Follow. Let's stand. Let us know how we can be a blessing today.